Hello everyone and welcome to our update on Hebrew New Testament manuscripts. We are very excited to announce the identification of several more authentic copies of the Hebrew Gospels as well as a second copy of the Hebrew Revelation, James and Jude. However, we also want to talk about the Vatican EBR 100 manuscript. Several years ago, when we first opened our website, this was the only authentic Hebrew New Testament manuscript that we knew of, and it contains Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in Hebrew and contains some very important differences compared to the standard Greek version. For example, this is John or Yochanan chapter 1, and it says, Batchila haya ben ha'Eloah. In the beginning was the son of Eloah, or God. And just to clarify, this is Ben, son as in child or descendant, S-O-N in English. And let's read further. Uven ha'el im ha'el, and the son of El was with El. Uven ha'el haya Eloah, and the son of El was Eloah. So the Hebrew Gospel of Yochanan does not start out by saying, in the beginning the Word, the Word, the Word. It starts by saying, in the beginning the Son, the Son, the Son. And did you know that this theme of the Messiah being called the Son is also prominent in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Old Testament? For example, Psalm 2, Yahweh said unto me, You are my son. Isaiah chapter 9, For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. And in context, these are prophecies about the Messiah. So not only does the Hebrew Gospel of Yochanan match this theme of the Messiah being the son of Elohim, but what is the very purpose of the Gospel of John? Let's read from chapter 20. Why did John compose this Gospel? Yeshua Mashiach did many miracles in the sight of his Talmidim, which are not written in this scroll. But these were written in order that you may believe that Yeshua Mashiach is the Word? No, the Son of El. And in order that you may believe them and you may have life in eternity with Yeshua Mashiach. So even just internally, if we look inside the Gospel of John, we can see that the purpose is not to convince us that Yeshua is the Word, the Word, the Word. The purpose is to convince us that Yeshua, Mashiach, is the Son of Elohim. And so what makes more sense than for the original Hebrew version to begin with, in the beginning, the Son, the Son, the Son. It makes perfect sense. Now, of course, we can't just grab any manuscript of the New Testament that looks interesting or exotic and claim that that is the original version of the New Testament. No, we first need to do a lot of investigation to make sure that this manuscript is really authentic. And many people also don't understand what is meant by the term authentic. What is an authentic Hebrew New Testament manuscript? There are three main tests that will show whether a Hebrew New Testament manuscript is authentic or not. Number one, an authentic Hebrew New Testament manuscript cannot derive from the Greek, Latin, or Aramaic versions from a linguistic perspective. In other words, if you carefully compare the Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and Latin texts of the New Testament, an authentic Hebrew New Testament manuscript will be unique, and it cannot be a translation from any one of these standard versions of the New Testament. But then we also need to look at point number 2. An authentic Hebrew New Testament manuscript is not just unique, but it will also contain characteristics of documents originally written in Hebrew. That includes Hebrew wordplay, Hebrew keyword repetition, gapping of explicit objects and subjects in ambiguous contexts, as well as differences that will show very clearly that the Greek text is a mistranslation. Sometimes when we look at the differences between the Hebrew and Greek versions of the New Testament, we can show very clearly which is the original text that was misread by the translator. We also talk more about this in video 5 about the Hebrew revelation. And then point number 3 is also very important. The text of an authentic Hebrew New Testament manuscript will not be corrupt. For example, it will not contradict the Tanakh, the Old Testament, nor deny Yeshua as the Messiah, etc. And this reminds me of the Shem Tov Matthew, because the Shem Tov version of Matthew does not pass test number 3. The Shem Tov Matthew never once acknowledges Yeshua as the Messiah from the author's perspective. Yes, the demons call Yeshua the Messiah. Yeshua claims to be the Messiah. Peter says Yeshua is the Messiah. But in the Shem Tov Matthew, the author never once identifies Yeshua as the Messiah. There are 4 places in the Greek version of Matthew where the author says that Yeshua is the Messiah, and each of these were removed from the Shem Tov Matthew. Not only that, but the Shem Tov Matthew also contains purposeful corruptions in the text to mock at Yeshua and to ridicule Yeshua. Because remember, the Shem Tov Matthew is part of an anti-missionary book. And unfortunately, someone started editing this Matthew contained in the Shem Tov book to even mock at the Messiah. Let's look at one example. It says here, Waya'an Sar Hameot Wayomer Lo. Then the chief of 100 answered and said to him, Adoni, eincha ra'ui shetavo tachat gagi. Lord, you are not worthy to come under my roof. Really? Is that what the centurion said to Yeshua? The centurion came to Yeshua pleading with Yeshua, please come heal my son. And when Yeshua says, yes, I will come, he then turns around and says, no, Lord, you're not worthy to enter my house. Obviously not. This is a purposeful change in the text. This word eincha means you are not. The ein is are not or is not, and the cha is the you. This should have said eini ra'ui. It should have had a yod there at the end instead of this final kaf. Can you see that this final kaf looks very different compared to this yod just above my pointer? That's a yod, that's a final kaf. In other words, a yod and a final kaf cannot be accidentally confused. This is not an accidental scribal mistake. This is a purposeful change in the text to belittle Yeshua and mock at Yeshua. And this is not the only Shem Tov Matthew that contains this corruption. Let's look at this manuscript from the British Library, which is generally seen as the best single copy of the Shem Tov Matthew. And it also says, Eincha ra'ui, you are not worthy to enter my house. This is a purposeful change in the text to belittle Yeshua. Can we really trust a text like this? Of course not. This is corruption in the Shem Tov Matthew. On the contrary, the Vatican EBR 100 manuscript declares Yeshua as the Messiah, starting in Matthew 1 verse 1, Ze Sefer Toledot Mashiach. This is the book of the genealogy of Mashiach. And in fact, if you read through the Hebrew Matthew contained in Vatican EBR 100, you will see that it acknowledges Yeshua as the Messiah from the author's perspective much more frequently than even the Greek version of Matthew. So that is why point number 3 is so important. Many people understand point 1 and point 2, and they forget about point number 3, which clearly shows us that the Shem Tov Matthew is not fully authentic. Because the Shem Tov Matthew is unique, it contains Hebrew wordplay and so on, but it was purposefully changed to deny Yeshua as the Messiah. So each of these 3 points is very important. And of course, it takes a lot of evidence to prove that any particular manuscript really passes all three these tests. So, for more information about the Hebrew Gospels from Sepharad and evidence of authenticity, please see our website HebrewGospels.com and especially the introductions to Mark and John, which will explain a lot of evidence of authenticity for the Vatican EBR 100 manuscript. Now, many people have been blessed by the Hebrew Gospels from Sepharad. Many people have been excited about these translations. However, many other people have been very skeptical, and some have even outrightly opposed the work that we're doing with the Hebrew Gospels. And these people who deny the authenticity of the Vatican manuscript have raised three main objections against the authenticity of the Vatican EBR 100 manuscript. Let's have a look at these three objections. Number one, people say, it's only one manuscript. It can't be authentic. We've got thousands and thousands of Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Of course, this Hebrew manuscript is worthless. Point number two, many people say, oh, this manuscript is from the Vatican Library. It must be a fraud. It must be a forgery that the Vatican invented in order to deceive us. And point number three, many people say, it contains Catalan names. It can't be authentic. If these Hebrew scribes were so uneducated and incompetent that they could not even spell a Hebrew name correctly, how can you trust anything in this manuscript? Now, each of these three objections can be thoroughly refuted based solely on internal evidence in the Vatican manuscript. However, we no longer need to do just that because we now have access to multiple copies of the Hebrew Gospels from Sepharad, which makes it so much easier to refute each of these objections. So today we want to work through these objections one at a time, and as we go through, I will also show you the newly identified manuscripts of the Hebrew Gospels from Sepharad. So let's start with point number one. People say, it's only one manuscript. We've got thousands of copies in Greek, hundreds of copies in Aramaic. How can this one Hebrew copy be authentic? Let's first of all talk about the logic behind this argument. Did you know that there are far more English Bibles than Greek Bibles? In fact, there are millions and millions of English Bibles around the world, but only thousands of Greek New Testament manuscripts. Does that automatically prove that the English is the original text of the New Testament and the Greek is a second-hand translation because there are more copies in English than in Greek? Of course not. That's a ridiculous argument, to say the least. How about the Hebrew Old Testament? There are far more English Bibles than Hebrew Bibles of the Old Testament. In fact, there are millions and millions of copies of English Bibles that contain the Old Testament and only thousands of Hebrew manuscripts and fragments of the Old Testament. Does that automatically prove that the Old Testament was originally written in English and not in Hebrew? Of course not. And yet, people want to use this same logic to argue against all and any Hebrew New Testament manuscripts, because there are far more Greek New Testament manuscripts than Hebrew New Testament manuscripts. Does that automatically prove that the Greek is the original and the Hebrew is a worthless translation? Not at all. In fact, it is to be expected that there will be more copies in a popular translation than in the original language. That should not surprise us at all. Regardless whether the New Testament was first written in Hebrew or Greek, there will be less copies in Hebrew. That is just a fact. Why? Because there were very few Messianic Jews throughout the Middle Ages who kept on copying the Hebrew New Testament. But there were very many Greek, Christians, and sometimes even non-Christians who kept copying the Greek New Testament throughout the Middle Ages. And that is why there are so many Greek New Testament manuscripts and so few Hebrew New Testament manuscripts. This does not automatically prove which one is the original text. And yet, this is the number one argument that people always bring against the Hebrew New Testament. They say, no, there are more copies in Greek, of course that is the original. But that is an entirely flawed argument. And by the way, it's not just one manuscript in Hebrew. We now have access to multiple copies of the Hebrew Gospels in Hebrew. So, how did we access these newly identified manuscripts? We recently did a search via this website called Ketiv. Ketiv means written, and this is a special section of the online National Library of Israel that focuses specifically on Hebrew manuscripts. So previously, when we searched for Hebrew New Testament manuscripts via the National Library of Israel, we found a lot of Greek and Latin manuscripts of the New Testament and other languages, but not much in Hebrew. But in the meantime, they've been updating the catalogs, and if we search via this website, Ketiv, we can search for Hebrew manuscripts only. So if we do a search here for Brit Chadashah, that's the Hebrew term for New Testament, we actually find 125 manuscripts that are related to the New Testament. Not each of these is a copy of the New Testament in Hebrew. Many of these are anti-missionary books, but quite a number of these are copies of New Testament books in Hebrew. However, we still need to distinguish between the authentic and the non-authentic copies, because many of these are simply translations from Greek back into Hebrew or from Aramaic back into Hebrew, etc. For example, the first manuscript that you can see here on the screen says the Hebrew version of the epistles of James and Jude, and it's from the British Library. We actually studied this manuscript several years ago when we accessed it via the British Library, and we found that this manuscript was not authentic. It was simply translated from the Aramaic Peshitta back into Hebrew. It has no evidence of authenticity that would prove that it somehow predates the other versions of the New Testament. So it was very interesting, but not authentic. The second example here on the screen says Evan Bochan. That is Shem Tov's anti-missionary book, which often contains a copy of the Hebrew Matthew. But then it's the Shem Tov version of Matthew, which denies Yeshua as the Messiah from the author's perspective, and so on and so forth. So it's very important that we must distinguish between authentic and non-authentic copies of the Hebrew New Testament manuscripts. So many people just make assumptions. Most people just assume that they are all useless translations. But some other people again assume that they are all copies of the original, preserving the original text. No, we must distinguish. And to emphasize this point, I want to show you one good example of a Hebrew New Testament manuscript that looked interesting, but turned out to be a very corrupt text of the New Testament. This manuscript is from Sweden. It looks very interesting. It contains Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and a few of Paul's epistles. However, this manuscript was not authentic. It contains some interesting differences compared to the Greek text, and so I read through the first chapter of Matthew, trying to note every difference compared to the Greek text to see whether these differences would prove authenticity or corruption in the text of this New Testament manuscript. So let's look at one example. It says here that Yoram holid et Hoshea, v'Hoshea holid et Yotam. This is the genealogy of Yeshua, right? Did you notice the big problem? It says here that Joram begot Hosea, and Hosea begot Jotham. Now, Hosea was not a king of Judah. Joram and Jotham were two kings of Judah, but Hosea was a king of Israel, of the northern kingdom. So what's written here in this manuscript is absolute nonsense, because it essentially says that the king of Judah begot the king of Israel, and the king of Israel then begot the king of Judah. This is not true whatsoever. It should have had the name Uzziah in here instead of the name Hoshea. Now, how did this mistake enter the text? If you look at these Hebrew names, you will see that most of them are correctly spelled in terms of consonants, even though the vowel points are not very accurate. So it seems that maybe the scribe who copied this manuscript used the Tanakh, the Hebrew Old Testament, to find the correct spelling for each of these names. However, if you go to a book like Kings, then you read about the king of Judah, and then about the king of Israel, and then about the king of Judah, and then about the king of Israel. And it seems that someone did not pay attention, and they got mixed up, and they inserted one of the kings of Israel here instead of inserting the name of the king of Judah. So it's a serious mistake. The only other possibility is that maybe someone got confused between the prophet Hosea, who prophesied at the time of King Uzziah, and King Uzziah. But either way, Hosea was not the father of Jotham. It's completely wrong. It's not just a copyist mistake where they accidentally misread one letter or accidentally left out a word. No, this is a corruption in the text. Let's have a look at another example. In the same chapter, Matthew chapter 1, it says here, Yehuda holid et Peretz ve'et Zarach mitamar. Judah begot Peretz and Zarach from Tamar, ve'Zarach holid et Ezra, ve'Ezra Aram. Did you notice the big problem? It says here that Zarach, also known as Zerach or Zara, begot Ezra, and Ezra begot Aram. In other words, this copy of the New Testament describes King David and ultimately Yeshua as descendant of Zarach or Zerach, the son of Judah. That is absolutely wrong, because we know from the Tanakh, for example, in the book of Ruth, it says explicitly that King David was a descendant of Peretz, the son of Judah, not a son of Zerach, the son of Judah. So this is a total mess. It's completely untrue. And one thing that you really need to notice is that the spelling of a Hebrew name does not guarantee the authenticity or corruption of a Hebrew New Testament text. These names are beautifully spelled in Hebrew. Peretz with a tzadeh, Zarach with a chet, even though usually in the Tanakh it would be Zerach. The consonants are correct, and yet the text is corrupt because it is untrue. So just keep that in mind. The spelling of a Hebrew name cannot automatically prove that a Hebrew manuscript is authentic. Now the good news is this: not all Hebrew New Testament manuscripts are corrupt, and not all Hebrew New Testament manuscripts are second-hand translations. Let's now also have a look at some authentic copies of the Hebrew Gospels. This manuscript is known as the JTS Breslau 233 manuscript. It is from Poland, and ironically, this is actually a copy of the Shem Tov Matthew. But someone decided it's not good enough to just have the Shem Tov Matthew. They're going to add Mark, Luke, and John in this manuscript. And they ended up adding Mark, Luke, and John in the same Sephardic version that we saw in the Vatican manuscript. So now we have a second copy of Mark, Luke, and John in the Sephardic version in this manuscript. And let's just look at one important agreement between this manuscript and the Vatican manuscript. In fact, before we read from the Hebrew manuscript, let's first consider the contradiction in the Greek version. This is about the death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua Mashiach. And the Hebrew Gospel of Yochanan completely solves this contradiction. Now, based on the Greek version of the Gospels, we know that Yeshua was buried before sunset, just before the high Sabbath started, okay? And we know that Joseph of Arimathea, Yosef Miramatayim, buried Yeshua in the grave before sunset. Were there any eyewitnesses of Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection? Yes. For example, we know that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were eyewitnesses of Yeshua's burial. They sat right opposite the grave as Joseph buried Yeshua's body in the grave. Okay, good. But then we also know from the Gospel of John that Nicodemus and Joseph anointed Yeshua's body with a large amount of ointment. Yeshua's body was properly embalmed when they buried Yeshua in the grave. Everything so far seems to make sense. However, why did the woman Mary Magdalene and the other Mary and the other woman come back 3 days later bringing spices and ointments to anoint Yeshua's body? They're supposed to be eyewitnesses of Yeshua's burial. But they don't even know that Joseph and Nicodemus already anointed Yeshua's body. How is that possible? This is a serious contradiction in the Greek version of the Gospels. And many people want to question Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection. No one can question that Yeshua really lived here on earth 2,000 years ago. But skeptics want to question Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection. So this is a very important topic. Now, the Hebrew version completely solves the contradiction and explains to us exactly why these women did not know that Yeshua's body was already anointed by Joseph and Nicodemus. So let's read from the Hebrew Gospel of Yochanan. It says, Az ba Yosef im Nicodemus le Yeshua balayla. Then Joseph came with Nicodemus to Yeshua balayla, in the night. Based on the Hebrew Gospel of Yochanan, Joseph and Nicodemus anointed Yeshua's body with ointments in the night. That means after sunset. In other words, before sunset, Joseph simply wrapped Yeshua's body in a linen cloth and buried Yeshua in the grave without anointing him before sunset. That's what the other women saw. They went back home thinking, we must come back and bring ointments to anoint Yeshua's body. After sunset, in the night, Joseph and Nicodemus came back to the grave and they anointed Yeshua's body in the night. That's why the women did not know anything about this. This solves the whole contradiction. However, what does the Greek version say? The Greek version says that Nicodemus, who previously had come to Yeshua by night, meaning John chapter 3, Nicodemus came to Yeshua in the night and asked Yeshua questions. In other words, the Greek version interpreted the text. They changed the text so it would not say they anointed Yeshua in the night. Maybe they thought this was a contradiction with the other Gospels saying that Yeshua was buried before sunset. So they interpreted the text saying this means Nicodemus who previously came to Yeshua in the night. So based on the Greek version, we could not know that Joseph and Nicodemus actually anointed Yeshua's body in the night after sunset. That crucial information was lost in the Greek Gospels, and now we have this big contradiction in the Greek Gospels. However, the Hebrew Gospel of Yochanan completely solves the problem. So there is no reason to doubt Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection. These eyewitness accounts are true. We simply need to go back to the Hebrew text of the Gospels to fully understand how all these events took place. Here's another copy of the Hebrew Gospels. This manuscript is from St. Petersburg in Russia, and it was copied from the Breslau manuscript. So it also contains the Shem Tov Matthew, but it's accompanied by Mark, Luke, and John in the Sephardic version. So this is not a Shem Tov Mark or a Shem Tov Luke and a Shem Tov John which deny Yeshua as the Messiah. No, this is basically the same text that we see in the Vatican manuscript that acknowledges Yeshua as the Messiah. However, I will also prove to you later today that these newly identified manuscripts were not copied from the Vatican manuscript. These are actually independent copies of the same textual tradition. So here you can see Mark chapter 15, and let's look at one important agreement between this manuscript and the Vatican manuscript. It says, Za'ak Yeshua bekol gadol ve'amar, Eli, Eli, lama azavtani, my El, why did you forsake me? Now remember, in the Greek version of Mark, it first quotes Yeshua in Aramaic and then translates the sentence into Greek. It quotes Yeshua in Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. That's Aramaic transliteration. And then it translates that into Greek. And we see the same thing in the Latin Vulgate, and we see the same thing even in the Aramaic Peshitta. It quotes Yeshua in Aramaic and then translates what Yeshua said into Aramaic. Of course, that doesn't make much sense. And many people have concluded, based on this and similar verses, that Yeshua spoke Aramaic on the cross. Meaning what? Many people then conclude that Yeshua could not speak Hebrew. Hebrew was a dead language. They could not quote the Bible in Hebrew, and they only spoke Aramaic, and that's why Yeshua quoted this verse in Aramaic on the cross. However, if we look at the Hebrew version, it does not quote Yeshua in Aramaic. Eli, Eli, lama azavtani is a direct quote from the Hebrew Old Testament. Yeshua could speak Hebrew, and he could quote from the Old Testament in Hebrew. And by the way, this also is an evidence of authenticity, because if the Hebrew Gospels from Sepharad derived from the Greek, Latin, or Aramaic Peshitta versions, it would have quoted Yeshua first in Aramaic and then in translation, based on the other versions. So very clearly, this was not translated from Greek, Latin, nor from the Aramaic Peshitta. For more information about this evidence of authenticity, as well as the previous interesting reading we just looked at from the Gospel of John, please see our introductions to Mark and John. Now, something that's very interesting is that these manuscripts from different places across the world are written in a Sephardic script. The Breslau manuscript, even though it's from Poland and originates from Turkey, is written in a Sephardic script. So remember, the Jews lived in Sepharad or Spain since before the 1st century CE. And then, of course, with the Inquisition, they were scattered across the world, and that's why we see Sephardic manuscripts in Sephardic scripts across the world in many different places. So this manuscript from Russia is also written in a Sephardic Jewish script. So we see very clearly the link between these Hebrew Gospels and the Jews from Sepharad, Spain. And then there is one more copy of the Hebrew Gospels from Sepharad that we have access to right now, and that is from the National Library of Israel. This manuscript is the latest manuscript of the lot. It's barely 120 years old. However, it was copied from the Breslau manuscript. And as I'll prove to you later today, the Breslau manuscript was copied from earlier manuscripts. So it still preserves the Hebrew text of the Gospels. And something that's very interesting is that this manuscript contains verse numbers. There you can see number 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. Now, sometimes people want to know, do these verse numbers prove that this is just a translation? Do these verse numbers prove that this is a translation from a modern Bible? No, not at all, because look at the Breslau manuscript. It contains no verse numbers at all. And yet, the later copy from the National Library of Israel does contain verse numbers. So the only thing that happened was that verse numbers became popular, and therefore the scribe of this manuscript decided to add the verse numbers to the text to enable easy navigation across the text so you can quickly find the verse that you are looking for. And the same is true for the Hebrew Revelation, James and Jude. If it contains verse numbers, it does not mean that it is a modern translation from a modern Bible. It simply means that it was copied several hundred years ago after the verse numbers became popular, and they added the verse numbers to the Hebrew text. If we want to know whether a manuscript is authentic, we need to look at the text, not the verse numbers inserted in between the text. Now, interestingly, this manuscript is written in an Ashkenazi Jewish script. However, like I said, it was copied from the Breslau manuscript, which is in a Sephardic script. So it still traces back to the Sephardic Jewish scribes who copied the Gospels in Hebrew. And let's look at one important agreement between this manuscript and the Vatican manuscript. This is Mark 6, verse 5. And remember what it says in the Greek version? It says that Yeshua was unable to do miracles there. Yeshua was not able to perform any miracles there because of their unbelief. Now that's a very big problem, because it seems to say in the Greek version that Yeshua is not almighty and that he can only do miracles if people have faith. Can we really limit Elohim by our faith? No, there are many examples in the Bible where Yahweh said something and then it happened, even though the people did not believe. Just as an example, when the angel said to Zechariah, "Your wife Elizabeth will conceive and bear a son," he did not believe it, and it still happened. So, look what it says in the Hebrew version. Velo ratzah asot sham shum pele. And he did not want to do any wonder there. Yeshua did not want, or he was not pleased, or he was not willing to do any wonder there because of people's unbelief. It is an insult to Elohim if we do not trust him, but it doesn't mean that he's unable to do miracles if people don't believe. So this is a very important difference in the Hebrew Gospels, and this is now confirmed in all 4 manuscripts of the Hebrew Gospels. In fact, each of these 3 important differences that we just looked at, Joseph and Nicodemus coming in the night, Yeshua speaking Hebrew on the cross, Yeshua not wanting to do miracles, each of these important differences are now confirmed in all 4 copies of the Hebrew Gospels. So, it's not just one manuscript. It's multiple manuscripts from various places across the world. And that brings us to point number 2, because people used to say, oh, this manuscript is from the Vatican Library. It must be a fraud, it must be a forgery that the Vatican invented to deceive us with. However, we now have multiple copies of the Hebrew Gospels. So, first of all, I understand that the Vatican Library has produced many frauds over the years. However, what many other people do not understand is that the Vatican Library also contains a lot of Jewish manuscripts that they never created or forged, that they confiscated from the Jewish people. This includes rabbinic commentaries, copies of the Mishnah, copies of the Old Testament, copies of anti-missionary books that they confiscated from the Jewish people, and these manuscripts ended up in the Vatican Library. So there are a lot of real Jewish manuscripts in the Vatican Library that are not frauds and forgeries that they invented. And if we look at this Vatican EBR 100 manuscript, we see that it is written in a Sephardic Jewish script. This was not written by a Catholic priest or a Vatican scholar. This was written by a Sephardic Jew. Now, you could still believe that the Vatican bribed a Sephardic Jew to write this manuscript. So that's why it's so important to note that these other manuscripts of the Hebrew Gospels have nothing to do with the Vatican Library. The Breslau manuscript is currently in Poland, and it originates from Turkey. It was written by a Sephardic Jewish scribe. It's a real Jewish manuscript. It was not created by the Vatican, nor was this manuscript in the hand of the Vatican ever. The St. Petersburg manuscript is in Russia. It's written in a Sephardic Jewish script. It's a genuine Jewish manuscript. It was not created by the Vatican. And yet these manuscripts that do not derive from the Vatican contain the same basic text that we see in the Vatican manuscript. The National Library of Israel manuscript is in Israel. It's written by an Ashkenazi Jew. It's a real Jewish manuscript. It was not created by the Vatican Library. So here is a summary. We now have access to 4 copies of the Hebrew Gospels in different places across the world, written in various styles of Sephardic script, and one in an Ashkenazi script, and one of these 4 manuscripts ended up in the Vatican. Very clearly, this tradition of the Hebrew Gospels does not originate from the Vatican. Now, I also want to prove to you very clearly that these other 3 manuscripts were not copied from the Vatican manuscript, because some people could still argue that all of this originated in the Vatican with Vatican EBR 100, and then they copied this into other manuscripts. However, we can very clearly prove that that is not the case. So now I want to prove to you very clearly that the Breslau 233 manuscript was not copied from the Vatican EBR 100 manuscript. And how are we going to prove this? We will look at several examples of scribal mistakes in the Vatican manuscript that were not transferred into the Breslau manuscript, as they would have been if the Breslau were a copy of the Vatican manuscript. So the first example is from Luke 6, verse 42. And in the Vatican manuscript it says, Hanach wa ani otzi hakesam me'enecha. Allow me that I may remove the splinter from your eye. Ve'az tabit shetegaresh hakesam me'ein achicha. And then you will see that you may remove the splinter from the eye of your brother. There's something missing here, because in context Yeshua just said, why do you see the splinter in your brother's eye while there is a beam in your own eye? Now it says, if you say to your brother, allow me to remove the splinter from your eye, then you will see well that you may remove the splinter from your brother's eye. There's something missing. Well, let's read in the Breslau manuscript. The Breslau manuscript says, Hanach li wa ani otzi hakesam me'enecha. Allow me that I may remove the splinter from your eye. Ramai garesh techila habriach me'enecha. Deceiver or hypocrite, first cast the beam out of your own eye. Ve'az tabit shetegaresh hakesam me'ein achicha. And then you will see that you may remove the splinter from your brother's eye. This phrase, first cast the beam out of your own eye, is missing in the Vatican manuscript. However, it is not missing in the Breslau manuscript. So if the Breslau manuscript were copied from the Vatican manuscript, where did they get this phrase from? Very clearly, if the Breslau manuscript were copied from the Vatican manuscript, the same mistake would have occurred in the very same place. So, what happened in the Vatican manuscript? If we look at the Breslau manuscript, we see that this word me'enecha, from your eye, occurs twice in this verse. In the Vatican manuscript, it occurs only once. So what happened was that the scribe of the Vatican manuscript wrote this phrase, Hanach wa ani otzi hakesam me'enecha, and then he looked back at the earlier manuscript trying to find the word me'enecha, because that's where he stopped copying, and he looked back and he saw the wrong me'enecha, and he accidentally omitted everything that comes in between these 2 words. Now, am I saying that the Vatican manuscript was copied from the Breslau manuscript? No, because the Breslau manuscript is actually younger than the Vatican manuscript. And also, the Breslau manuscript occasionally has a missing phrase which is not missing in the Vatican manuscript. So the bottom line is this: these are 2 independent copies of the same textual tradition. The one was not copied from the other, they were both copied from earlier sources of the Hebrew Gospels. And by the way, did you know that Greek manuscripts also contain mistakes? Here's one example in the Codex Sinaiticus from Matthew chapter 15. This phrase, teis kardias, occurs twice in this passage, once in verse 18 and once in verse 19. And teis kardias means of the heart. This is where Yeshua says that the evil thoughts proceed out of the heart of a man. And let's also look at this in a transcribed version. So you can clearly see teis kardias exergetai and teis kardias exergontai. These two phrases look very similar. And this teis kardias is exactly the same in verse 18 and 19. And the scribe of the Codex Sinaiticus accidentally omitted everything between the first and second occurrence of teis kardias. And so there's a missing phrase in the Codex Sinaiticus, and someone filled this into the margin, showing the mistake. So if there's a missing phrase in the Vatican manuscript, it doesn't mean automatically that this is a corrupt manuscript. No, this is a very normal scribal mistake that occurs in almost all manuscripts of the Bible. And the fact that this same mistake does not occur in the same place in the Breslau manuscript simply shows that these are two independent copies of the same text. Let's look at a second example. This is from John chapter 2. In the Vatican manuscript, it says, Ra lo yad'a me'ayin ba. This word Ra, Reish Aleph, does not mean a thing in Hebrew. Ra with an ayin would have meant bad, and that also doesn't make any sense in the context. It says here, Lo yad'a me'ayin ba, she did not know where it came from. This refers to the wine where Yeshua turned water into wine, and in the Hebrew Gospels, the chief servant at this wedding feast in John chapter 2 is described as a woman, as a she-servant. So she did not know where the good wine came from. But this word, Ra, very clearly it is a scribal mistake. Now, let's have a look at the Breslau manuscript. Does the same mistake occur in the same place? No, it says here, Rak lo yad'a me'ayin ba. But she did not know from where it was. So it has the word rak. That makes sense in Hebrew. Rak means but, or only. But she did not know where it came from. So the same mistake does not occur in the same place in the Breslau manuscript. If you look at this word Reish Aleph, there's no way that anyone could think that Aleph right there is a Kof. No one would have changed that word Reish Aleph into Rak when simply copying the Vatican manuscript. So by the way, how did this mistake enter the Vatican manuscript? If this is supposed to say Rak, how did that Kof turn into an Aleph by mistake in the Vatican manuscript? This is a very interesting point. And this also proves that the Vatican manuscript was copied from earlier Hebrew manuscripts in the Sephardic script. As you can see here, an Aleph and a Kof can look similar, but only at the end of a line. In the middle of a line, they don't look similar at all. But there at the end of the line, you can see the word Wetikra, and you must call. That is the Kof, and that is the squashed in Aleph at the end of the line. The Kof and the Aleph can look like two mirror images of each other. They can look very similar. In the middle of a line, an Aleph cannot look like a Kof. But at the end of a line, when they squashed it in like this, the Aleph looks very similar to a Kof. It's just the other way around. So we see several examples of this curly Aleph, which looks like the curly Kof, but this Aleph in this shape only occurs at the end of a line. Proving what? Proving that the Vatican manuscript was copied from an earlier copy of the Hebrew Gospels in the Sephardic script, in which the word Rak stood at the end of a line, because only at the end of a line can the Kof and Aleph be confused. So in an earlier manuscript, that was the last word in the line, and the scribe confused the Kof and the Aleph, and so this scribal mistake entered the Vatican manuscript. So even if we only had access to the Vatican EBR 100 manuscript, this scribal mistake here in John 2 verse 9 clearly shows that the Vatican manuscript was not the first copy of the Hebrew Gospels. There had to be an earlier copy in which this word Rak stood at the end of the line, and therefore the scribe confused the Kof with an Aleph. If there were no earlier manuscripts of the Hebrew Gospels, and if the Vatican manuscript was the first invention of the Hebrew Gospels, this mistake would never have existed in the Vatican manuscript. So can you believe that even a scribal mistake proves the authenticity of the Vatican manuscript? It's not a new forgery, it was copied from earlier manuscripts in Hebrew. And the Breslau manuscript is an independent witness of the same textual tradition. Let's now look at one example where we can compare the St. Petersburg manuscript with the Vatican EBR 100 manuscript. And this is in John chapter 19. Here it says, Shekol Hadivarim Ta'u. Yeshua knew that all things, and then this problematic word, Ta'u, had gone astray. Yeshua is on the cross, and Yeshua knew that all things had gone astray. Clearly that doesn't make sense. It's a scribal mistake. Does the same mistake occur in the same place in the St. Petersburg manuscript? No, look what it says down here. Yada Yeshua shekol hadevarim tamu. Yeshua knew that all things were completed. Now it makes perfect sense. If the St. Petersburg manuscript were copied from the Vatican manuscript, why would they have changed that ayin into a mem? In this case, you can clearly see the ayin there. Doesn't look like a mem in this case. So this manuscript, the St. Petersburg manuscript, is not just a copy from the Vatican manuscript. However, we know that in some cases the mem and the ayin can look similar, and that's how this mistake entered the Vatican manuscript. For example, this word here, malay, that mem looks very similar to an ayin except for this curl at the beginning of the letter. If you ignore that part of the letter, the rest of the mem looks very much like an ayin. You can see an ayin up there, and if you just put a curl to the right hand side, then it looks like a mem. So sometimes when the letters were squashed in, if they're squashing a lot of text into one line, or if the manuscript maybe gets damaged by water, then a mem and an ayin can look very similar. And that's how this mistake entered the Vatican manuscript. It proves it was copied from an earlier Hebrew manuscript in which the mem and the ayin looked similar, and so they accidentally wrote an ayin in here instead of a mem. However, right here, this ayin in the Vatican manuscript does not look like a mem. So very clearly, the Hebrew Gospels from Sepharad did not originate in the Vatican library. The Vatican manuscript was copied from earlier manuscripts of the Hebrew Gospels, and the St. Petersburg manuscript and the Breslau manuscript, etc., were copied from earlier copies of the Hebrew Gospels, not from the Vatican manuscript. These are independent witnesses of the same text. Let's also look at one example where we compare the National Library of Israel manuscript with the Vatican EBR 100. And this example is in Mark chapter 13. It says here in the Vatican manuscript, Keshe mitchelet lachayot or lichiyot. I don't know how to pronounce that word because it's a scribal mistake. And in our translation, we had to guess maybe this is lichiyot with a tau instead of a tate, and we put this in square brackets because we could not understand that word. So there's a scribal mistake there. However, in the National Library of Israel manuscript, it says Keshe mitchelet lachanot, which means when it begins to grow and make buds. The root of this word is chet nun tet, chanat, and that word is specifically used in Mishnaic Hebrew, meaning post-exilic Hebrew, 1st century and onwards, to refer to trees that begin to grow again in summer. And that's exactly what Yeshua talks about when the fig tree begins to grow and make leaves. So, if the National Library of Israel manuscript derived from the Vatican manuscript, why does the same mistake not occur here in the same place? Very clearly, because the same mistakes do not occur in the same place between these manuscripts, they are independent copies of the same text. They were not copied the one from the other. The National Library of Israel manuscript does not derive from the Vatican manuscript. Now, it is true that the National Library of Israel manuscript and the St. Petersburg manuscript were copied from the Breslau manuscript. Let's just sum this up in a chart. As you can see here, the St. Petersburg manuscript and the National Library of Israel manuscript are direct copies of the Breslau manuscript. But the Breslau manuscript is a completely independent copy compared to the Vatican manuscript. The Vatican manuscript was copied from earlier Sephardic Hebrew Gospels, and the Breslau manuscript was copied from earlier copies of the Sephardic Hebrew Gospels. So now that we have these multiple copies, we can prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that the Hebrew Gospels do not derive from the Vatican Library. Just one of these copies was confiscated and ended up in the Vatican Library. And by Yahweh's provision, that manuscript was not burned, and today we can even study this manuscript and learn from it. It's not something that the Vatican Library invented at all. So let's move on to objection number 3. People say, no, these Hebrew Gospels contain Catalan names, and if the scribes could not even spell a Hebrew name correctly, then how can we trust anything in this manuscript? Is this a valid argument? Well, let's first of all start by looking at an example of misspelled Hebrew names. This is Matthew chapter 1, and it says, Judah holid Peres v'Zara mitamar. Judah begot Peres and Zara from Tamar. Peres holid Esrom, and so on. Now, Judah is just a medieval spelling of the name Yehudah. But Peres is misspelled because it should have had a tzadeh at the end. Zara is misspelled because it should have had a chet at the end. And Esrom is misspelled, it should have been Chetzron. So yes, many of these names are misspelled. But the first thing that you need to realize is that the spelling of a Hebrew name does not prove whether the manuscript is authentic or not. Remember this manuscript from Sweden? It had the correct spellings. Peretz and Zarach with a chet, correctly spelled in terms of Hebrew consonants, and yet the text is completely corrupt because it says that Zarach is the ancestor of King David, and that's a lie. If you look in the Vatican manuscript, it says that Peres was the ancestor of King David. That's correct. It's easy to connect Peres with Peretz, Zara with Zarach, and so on. We can identify these people, and the text is correct despite the names that were misspelled. But let's now get to the big question. Were these scribes incompetent? Were they ignorant? No, these Hebrew scribes were not stupid at all. In Matthew chapter 1, we see that the names Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are misspelled. We see Avraham instead of Avraham, Yitzhak instead of Yitzchak, and Yaakov instead of Yaakov. But in Matthew chapter 8, we see Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, perfectly spelled with Hebrew consonants, with the Hebrew spelling. And in the next line we see Yisrael. That's an aleph and a lamed in one. It's perfectly spelled in Hebrew. Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Yisrael. These scribes knew very well how to spell Hebrew names. They were not ignorant. So then, why did they use the Latinized spellings so often, if they could spell the Hebrew names correctly? Let's look at another example. Here in Matthew chapter 10, we read about the names of the 12 disciples that Yeshua appointed. And again, most of the names are not correctly spelled in Hebrew. We see, for example, Matthew. But if we see Matthew, we know that's Matthew, that's Matityahu. It's not too difficult to identify these names. Now, here's something very interesting. In the second line, it says Shimon Kanai. Kanai is a perfect Hebrew word. Shimon Kanai means zealous Simon or Simon the Zealot. This Hebrew word Kanai means zealous or zealous one. And it is perfectly spelled in Hebrew. However, look what the scribe did. He drew a line through the Yod, through the Nun, through the Kof. he crossed out the correctly spelled Hebrew word just to replace it with a Latinized transliteration, Ka'av or Ka'iv or something like that. I don't know exactly how to pronounce that word because it's not a Hebrew word. Why would they even cross out the correctly spelled Hebrew title? They knew how to spell it, they could do it, but they had a plan and a purpose to use the Latinized spellings. Why? It seems that they might have done this to hide the authenticity of the manuscript. In other words, to make people think that this manuscript is not such a big threat to the Catholic system. Remember, in the Middle Ages, people were persecuted for having a copy of the Bible in their own language. How much more in Hebrew? And so they made this look like it comes from the Latin Vulgate by using the Latinized names. But if you look past the spelling of the Hebrew names, then you will see that the text of the Hebrew Gospels is completely unlike the Latin Vulgate. And the same can be said about the introductions. Before each of these Hebrew Gospels, there is a short introduction in Hebrew which looks very similar to the introductions found in the Latin Vulgate. So remember, the Latin Vulgate is the Catholic translation of the Bible. And they added these Latinized introductions, very similar to the Latin Vulgate, to the Hebrew Gospels. So to this day, most scholars ignore the Hebrew Gospels as if they don't exist or as if they're totally worthless. Why? Mostly because of the Latinized introductions and the misspelled Hebrew names. But it seems this is exactly what they wanted. They wanted their enemies, like the Catholic Church, etc., to think this manuscript is okay. They wanted to ensure the survival of this manuscript. So the fact that many of these Hebrew names are misspelled in the Hebrew Gospels does not prove that it was translated from the Latin Vulgate. Anyone can read translations of the Latin Vulgate online. You can also read our translations of the Hebrew Gospels. And if you just look past the Latinized introductions and past the Latinized names, which don't change the text, and you look at the text of the Hebrew Gospels, you will see that they are completely different compared to the Latin Vulgate translation. Now, it is possible that the Hebrew Gospels from Sepharad have a Catalan subtext. That would mean that the text went from Hebrew to Catalan back to Hebrew. That is a possibility. However, it is entirely impossible that the Hebrew Gospels from Sepharad derive from the Greek, Latin, or Aramaic versions of the New Testament. Even today, we've seen examples where the Hebrew Gospels from Sepharad correct important contradictions in the Greek, Latin, and Aramaic versions of the New Testament. And interestingly, the other manuscripts often use Hebrew names where the Vatican manuscript has the Latinized spelling. For example, here in Luke chapter 1, we see Melech Yehudah, the king of Judah. Yehudah is correctly spelled here in the Breslau manuscript. And at the end of the line, we see Ushma Elisheva, and her name was Elisheva, correctly spelled in Hebrew. So even where the Vatican manuscript uses the Latinized spellings, the other manuscripts of the Hebrew Gospels often use the Hebrew spellings. Let's also zoom in. The color photographs are in low resolution, but there are black and white photos in high resolution. Here you can see the Hebrew word Yehudah and Zechariah, correctly spelled in Hebrew, Ushma Elisheva, and her name was Elizabeth, Shmo Yochanan, his name Yochanan. These scribes knew very well how to spell Hebrew names. And interestingly, the Vatican EBR 100 manuscript even preserves unique Hebrew names that cannot be reclaimed from the Greek, Latin, or Aramaic versions of the New Testament. For example, we see in John chapter 18, Bar Evan. Barabbas is called here in the Hebrew Gospels Bar Evan, the son of Evan. And on the next line, again we see Uvar Even Ganav Haya, and Bar Even was a thief. This word Bar Even cannot be reclaimed from the Greek, Latin, or Aramaic versions of the New Testament, because the Greek New Testament says his name is Barabbas. And if you translate that back into Hebrew, like Franz Delitzsch did, you get Bar Abba, son of the father. You cannot translate the Greek text back into Hebrew and reclaim this Hebrew name Bar Even. It is a unique Hebrew name preserved here in the Hebrew Gospels from Sepharad. Now, some people read this name as Baravan instead of Bar Even. Baravan would mean son of the rabbi or son of the teacher. However, based on this aleph in the middle of the word, it seems that this might rather be Bar Even. Either way, this is a unique Hebrew name preserved in the Hebrew Gospels that cannot be reclaimed from the Greek text. So these Jewish scribes were really not uneducated or incompetent. They even preserve Hebrew names that we cannot reclaim from the Greek text. Here is another example. This is from John chapter 20. Thomas, who is called Didymus. In Hebrew, they have a special name for him. It says here, Shenikra, who is called Mispak. Mispak means doubtful or doubter. And we also see this in the Breslau manuscript. Mispak lo haya imahem kashe Yeshua ba alehem. Mispak was not with them when Yeshua came unto them. He has a Hebrew nickname, Mispak, doubtful, and this name cannot be reclaimed from the Greek translation because the Greek translation says Didymus. That's a Greek name. Look what Franz Delitzsch did. He simply transliterated this back into Hebrew. Didymos, that's what you get if you translate the Greek text back into Hebrew. This Hebrew name Mispak cannot be reclaimed from the Greek, Latin, or Aramaic versions of the New Testament. It's unique to the Hebrew Gospels from Sepharad. And again, we could read this name with a different vocalization. We could read this as Mesupak, which still means doubtful. The point is that in the Hebrew Gospels, Thomas, or Thomas, has a Hebrew nickname, not a Greek nickname. So these Hebrew scribes who copied the Hebrew Gospels from Sepharad knew even more about Hebrew names than the opponents of the Hebrew Gospels, because they cannot even reclaim these names from the Greek text. So the bottom line is this. The Hebrew scribes were not incompetent or uneducated. They could write the Hebrew names correctly. They even preserved unique Hebrew names. However, they had a plan and a purpose, especially in the Vatican manuscript. They did not want to use the Hebrew names, especially at the beginning of every book. They wanted to make this look from the outside superficially like a translation from Latin. And to this day, most scholars ignore this manuscript and think it's useless and harmless. Why? Because of the Latinized spellings in the names and because of the Latin-based introductions. Their plan still works to this day. And only if we read past the Latinized Hebrew names and concentrate on the text, then we see the text is totally different compared to the Latin Vulgate. And if we read past the first few chapters, then we see that they actually knew how to spell the Hebrew names, and they even preserved the unique Hebrew names for us. So with that, we have now refuted each of these three objections against the Vatican manuscript. It's not just one manuscript. It's multiple copies from various places across the world. It does not derive from the Vatican library. There are independent copies, like the Breslau manuscript and the Vatican manuscript. Both those manuscripts were copied from earlier manuscripts of the Hebrew Gospels. This does not originate from the Vatican library. And number 3, the Catalan names are purposeful. If we just read past the Latinized names and introductions, we see that the text of the Hebrew Gospels is authentic and that these scribes even knew unique Hebrew names that we cannot reclaim from the Greek version of the Gospels. So let's now move on to the Hebrew revelation, James and Jude. This manuscript you're seeing on the screen is known as the Cambridge University Library 00.1.16. However, it originates from India. This manuscript was found in a Jewish synagogue in India, where it was copied and preserved by the local Indian Jews. And this manuscript contains very important differences compared to the standard Greek version. We'll discuss one or two of these important differences just now. A similar manuscript was also found in this Jewish synagogue, known as 00.1.32, and this manuscript contains nearly the entire New Testament. It contains every book in the New Testament except for Revelation. However, most of these books are not authentic. If you look at this manuscript in Hebrew, you will see that there were several different Jewish scribes who copied this manuscript with various scripts, and they also used different source texts for the different books. For example, the Gospels and several of the epistles are very clearly translated from the Aramaic Peshitta back into Hebrew. We have more information about this in our introductions to the Hebrew revelation, James and Jude. However, when it comes to the epistles of James and Jude and the book of Revelation in these manuscripts from India, there's no way that they could derive from the Greek, Latin, or Aramaic versions of those books. So they're unique. And we also have a lot of information in our introductions to these translations about evidence of authenticity. Today we'll just look at a few examples. Now, as we searched through the Hebrew manuscripts via the National Library of Israel, we also looked out for more copies of Revelation, James and Jude, and for any other book of the New Testament that we could find. And there were several copies of the book of Revelation. However, most of these were not authentic. Let's look at one example of a non-authentic Hebrew manuscript of Revelation. This manuscript is from Germany. It contains the entire New Testament in Hebrew, except for some missing pages. However, we looked at every book, and this manuscript is not authentic. Let's look at one example of a corruption in the text of this manuscript of Revelation. This is Revelation chapter 1, and it says, Hinei shara alai haruach, behold, the Spirit rested on me, b'yom hashemesh, on the day of the sun, meaning on Sunday. And this time, this is the sun up in the sky, as in S-U-N. The sun was idolized by many pagan nations, and in the 4th century CE, the Catholic Church officially changed Sabbath to Sunday in honor of the sun deity. So Sunday has a very pagan origin. However, after they incorporated Sunday into the Catholic Church system, many people have tried to defend Sunday as a biblical day. And one of the claims was that the day of the Lord in Revelation chapter 1 refers to Sunday. And some manuscripts of the Peshitta even say on the first day of the week. That means Sunday. They just took this one step further and they said that Revelation happened on Sunday, supposedly. Very clearly, this cannot be the original version of Revelation because Sunday was only instituted in the 4th century CE. This is not an authentic copy of Revelation, but actually a corrupt copy of Revelation, even with pagan tradition built into this translation. So not all copies of Revelation in Hebrew are authentic. We must distinguish. The good news is that there was a second authentic copy of the Hebrew Revelation, James and Jude. This manuscript is known as the Gaster 1616 manuscript from the Manchester University Library, and it was copied from 00.1.16 and 00.1.32 after those manuscripts were brought from India to the UK. So it contains basically the same text as these older manuscripts from India. Although it contains the entire New Testament, only Revelation, James and Jude are authentic. So let's have a look at Revelation chapter 1 in this manuscript. The Hebrew Revelation is not even called the book of Revelation. Let's read in chapter 1, verse 1. It says, Ele hasodot. These are the confidential counsels. The Hebrew revelation is known as the book of Sodot, the confidential counsels which Yahweh made known to us. Now, this makes an important keyword theme throughout the book of Revelation. For example, chapter 1 verse 20 says, Now the confidential counsel, the sword of the 7 stars. So this Hebrew word is sword in the singular and sodot in the plural. It's the same word. Chapter 10 verse 7, all these confidential counsels, all these sodot of Yahweh will be completed. This verse confirms that the whole book of Revelation is about the sodot of Yahweh that will be fulfilled. Chapter 17 verse 5, the secret of the great city Babel. 17 verse 7, I want to tell you the secret, the sword of the women. This keyword theme is partially preserved in second-hand translations like the Greek or the Latin or the Aramaic. However, in the Hebrew revelation, it starts with chapter 1, verse 1, which is very, very interesting. Now, in non-authentic copies of Revelation, this keyword theme does not start in chapter 1, verse 1. For example, this same manuscript from Germany starts out by saying, Chazon Yeshua HaMashiach, literally the vision of Yeshua HaMashiach. However, this word chazon is also used to refer to a revelation from Elohim. So second-hand translations from Greek, Latin or Aramaic always use some form of the word reveal or revelation in Revelation 1 verse 1, unlike the authentic Hebrew manuscript from India. Let's have a look at another important difference between the Greek and Hebrew versions of Revelation. This is in Revelation chapter 22, where Yeshua supposedly claimed that he is the morning star. Let's read this in Hebrew. Revelation 22:16. Ani Yeshua shalachti malachai, I Yeshua sent my messengers, leharot la'ida, to show the assembly, wa'ani shoresh mimishbechot David. Even I am the root of the families of David. It doesn't say here that Yeshua claimed to be the morning star. And this solves a huge contradiction, because in most English Bibles, Satan and Yeshua are both called the morning star. Satan in Isaiah chapter 14 and Yeshua in Revelation chapter 22. We also have a separate video all about that contradiction. So remember what we said earlier today about the verse numbers? The verse numbers do not prove that this is a modern translation into Hebrew. No, they simply started adding the verse numbers several hundred years ago when the numbering system became popular. So we need to read past the verse numbers and look at the text if we want to know whether the Hebrew revelation is authentic or not. Let's also have a look at the Epistle of James or Yaakov in this Gaster manuscript. Now, one thing that was changed between the older copies from India and the new copy from the Manchester University Library is, unfortunately, they lost the distinction between the name Yod-Heh and the title Elohim. In the older manuscripts, the name Yod-Heh is indicated by the abbreviation Hey, the Hebrew letter Hey for Hashem, the name. It marks every place where the name Yod-Heh should appear. And Elohim is spelled out in the older manuscripts. But in this manuscript, the scribe would often replace Hashem with Elohim. So it says here, Yaakov Eved Elohim, where it really should have said Yaakov Eved Yahweh. However, most of the other evidences of authenticity are preserved in this manuscript. For example, we see at the end of verse 1, Simcha mikodem, firstly, joy. In the Hebrew epistle of Yaakov, there is a clear theme of joy, starting in verse 1 and then in verse 2. Consider this as joy. Tachshavu zot lesimcha, be'im she'atem noflim b'nisayon, when you fall into a trial. And this Hebrew keyword simcha is repeated several times throughout the epistle of James in the Hebrew version, and that theme was completely lost in the Greek translation, but it is preserved in this manuscript from the Manchester University Library. Here you can see the Hebrew epistle of Yehuda. At the top is the older manuscript from the Cambridge University Library, which they brought from India, and at the bottom is the copy known as the Gaster 1616 manuscript. And here I want to show you one example where unfortunately the evidence of authenticity was lost in the Gaster manuscript. So this is Jude verse 5, and let's read at the top first. Aval ani rotze lehodia lachem zot. But I want to make this known to you, shezeh shehotzi et amo mimitzrayim, that he who brought his people out of Egypt. Now let's just stop there, because I want us to concentrate on this word shezeh, that he who brought his people out of Egypt. Now this verse has caused a lot of confusion in the Greek version, and to this day scholars in the Greek New Testament cannot agree on what is the original Greek text of Jude verse 5. Why? Because the Greek manuscripts don't say he who brought his people out of Egypt. Some Greek manuscripts say Jesus, Jesus, who brought his people out of Egypt. Other Greek manuscripts say the Lord, Kurios, who brought his people out of Egypt. Some Greek manuscripts say Theos, Elohim or God, who brought his people out of Egypt. So there's great confusion about the explicit subject here in Jude verse 5. However, in the Hebrew version, the explicit subject is gapped. It doesn't say Yeshua or the Lord or Yahweh or Elohim. It just says he who brought his people out of Egypt. And this really solves the whole debate about Jude verse 5. Because in the original Hebrew version, it did not state the explicit subject. And then various Greek translators or scribes decided to interpret the text, to explain the text to us, and they added various different explanations. And now no one knows where is the original Greek text of Jude verse 5. But it turns out there is no original Greek text for Jude verse 5. There is only an original Hebrew text for Jude verse 5, and the various Greek translators or scribes had different interpretations and explanations, and that caused a lot of confusion in the Greek text. Now, as you can see here, a later reader of this manuscript came across this word shezeh, and he decided that this Zion was not very clearly written. It can't be anything except a Zion, but he scratched it out and wrote 2 dots above it, which tell you to look in the margin, and in the margin he wrote the exact same word, shezeh. So this is just someone trying to write the same word in a more readable script, and in a different script there. Shezeh. Now, the scribe of the Gaster manuscript was copying this older manuscript from India into his copy, and when he came across this word, he saw that the Zion was scratched out. But rather than looking at the margin to see what the correction is and what's going on, he simply ignored the Zion in his translation. He just looked at the hey and the 2 dots. Now remember, if you have a hey and 2 dots, that's an abbreviation for Hashem. As you can see up here, May Hashem or Mi Yahweh, from Yodei Waw Hey, you have the hey with the 2 dots above it, that's the abbreviation for Hashem. So he thought that this is She Hashem, and he transcribed this as Sheha Elohim, and so he lost this extremely important evidence of authenticity from the text. Now, if you look at this photo in high resolution, you can clearly see that these 2 dots are not written in the original dark ink. They're in a light ink, the same ink that you see in the margin. The original scribe of the 00.1.32 manuscript did not write 2 dots above that Zion. He simply wrote shezeh. And by this whole misunderstanding, unfortunately, this one evidence of authenticity was lost in the Gaster manuscript. However, as we just saw, most of the evidences of authenticity were preserved in the Gaster manuscript. It's just that occasionally the scribe of the Gaster manuscript misread some of the letters or some of the words in this older manuscript from India. Because remember, this manuscript at the top of the screen is written in a very, very small cursive script. If you're watching this video on a laptop screen, the manuscript is actually smaller than you're seeing it on the screen. And so occasionally the scribe of the Gaster manuscript misread a letter or a word in the older manuscript. Now, if we look at Jude verse 25 in the Gaster manuscript, a very similar evidence of authenticity was preserved, because in this case, no one made a correction in the earlier manuscript, there could be no misunderstanding, and here in Jude verse 25, we read, Lazeh tiyeh kavod v'tiferet u'malchut me'olam v'ad olam, Amen. To him be honor and glory and kingship from everlasting and unto everlasting, Amen. The Hebrew version simply says, to him. The explicit object is gapped. However, in the Greek New Testament manuscripts, there is a lot of confusion about the explicit object of Jude verse 25, because some Greek manuscripts say, to the only wise God our Savior, while others say, to the only God our Savior through Jesus Christ our Lord, and there's even one manuscript which says, to our only wise Savior, and another manuscript which says, to our God, to him be glory, through Jesus Christ our Lord, to him be glory, and so on and so forth. And so the various Greek translators or scribes inserted various different explicit objects to this verse. And therefore there is so much confusion in the Greek version, and it is very difficult to know what is the original Greek text of Jude verse 25. But again, there is no original Greek text for Jude verse 25. There is only an original Hebrew text for Jude verse 25. And in the original Hebrew version, the explicit object is gapped. It simply says, to him, to him. And then the various translators or scribes interpreted the text in the Greek version. So very clearly, the Hebrew version preserves the original text, while the Greek version simply preserves interpreted translations based on the opinions of various scribes. So, I hope this also sparks your interest to do even more study about the Hebrew Gospels as well as the Hebrew Revelation, James and Jude. Please visit our website HebrewGospels.com for links to 7 manuscripts that contain authentic Hebrew copies of New Testament books. We also have translations of the Hebrew Matthew, Mark, John, James, Jude, and Revelation. Luke is still in progress. And we also have videos which explain more proof of authenticity and important differences from the Greek version. I just want to give you an example here. Previously, if you'd go to HebrewGospels.com/Mark and you click on View Manuscript, it would simply open the Vatican manuscript. However, now if you click on View Manuscripts, it opens this pop-up and you can choose which one of the 4 manuscripts of Mark you want to view online. So this is really exciting, and the same is also true for the Hebrew Revelation, James and Jude. We now have 2 manuscript witnesses, not just 1. So I hope you appreciate the effort it must have taken the Jewish scribes to preserve these Hebrew manuscripts throughout all the persecution in the Middle Ages. But most of all, we need to be thankful to Yahweh, who preserved these Hebrew manuscripts of the New Testament for us and allows us to access these manuscripts today. We don't even have to go overseas to view these manuscripts, and we can learn from them, and they solve important contradictions in the Greek version, etc. So, all glory be to Yahweh, and until next time, Shalom in Yeshua Mashiach.